Hey, welcome back. This is Shah. Today we're going to talk about dowries and marriage transactions. What is that? It's basically an amount of money that's paid at the time of the marriage, and it's either paid from the bride's family to the groom's side or from the groom's side to the bride's side. And we're going to look at a research paper called The Economics of Dowry and Bride Price by Siwan Anderson. She's a Canadian economist. She wrote this paper back in 2007. So if you want to find that and read that, it is available online to you. And it's going to help guide us a little bit to understand the economics behind this. And this topic is interesting to me because, especially if you're subscribed to this channel, you know that we talk a lot about marriage and divorce and the divorce rate and relationships. And it's not doing too well, particularly in the West. And a lot of us, especially now that we're living in this new world where people don't always adhere to traditional roles, we're trying to figure out, how do we conduct ourselves? What are the expectations that we should have? Just as a guy, I've been sort of conditioned to believe I'm supposed to be the provider, the sole provider. And, if you're going to get married, you better be able to put the down payment on the house and pay the bills and do all these kinds of things. And that's kind of your job as a man. But it gets confusing and harder to do, especially when we as men are now competing in the same job market as women, and that's affected wages, and it's made it harder to be that provider. So we're going to explore that, and then we're going to see what we can take from this and try to apply to our present day. Now, looking at our paper, we can kind of get an idea for the prevalence of marriage payments. And the surprising thing to me was that a lot more cultures than I expected have done some form of marriage payment or the other. Most societies at some point in their history have been characterized by payments at the time of marriage. Such payments typically go hand in hand with marriages arranged by the parents of the respective spouses. These marriage payments come in various forms and sizes, but can be classified into two broad categories: transfers from the family of the bride to that of the groom, broadly termed as dowry, or from the groom's side to the bride's, broadly termed as bride price. What's interesting is that in ancient times, it started off as bride price, but then in a lot of those same societies, it changed. In many ancient cultures, the practice of bride price began to wane, and a transformation to the custom of dowry occurred as these civilizations grew and flourished. This pattern occurred in the Babylonian Empire of Mesopotamia as the society slowly began to urbanize after the 18th century BCE. Similarly, the ancient Egyptians began to emphasize dowry by the 6th century BCE. Ancient Hebrews also experienced the same shifts away from bride price to dowry as they moved from pastoral nomadism on the fringes of Mesopotamia to settled agriculture and city life in the land of Canaan. So that's interesting because we got to ask ourselves, okay, what is it that led to this change? Why were they all paying bride price before, but then they started to receive a dowry? And it's going to be one of two things. The first of those two things is going to be the economic output that both parties contribute. Bride price paying societies have also been associated with a strong female role in agriculture. Bosrup, in particular, has argued that bride price is found in societies in which agriculture relies on light tools, such as the hoe, and thus where women are actively engaged. In contrast, she argues dowry is more common in heavy plow agriculture, where the role for women is limited. This connection seems supported by the occurrence of bride price in sub-Saharan Africa and China, where women's participation in agriculture is relatively high. The reemergence of dowry in medieval Europe also corresponded to a period of economic expansion coinciding with the introduction of heavier plow agriculture technology. In turn, this technology led to greater productivity, more surplus for trade, growth in commerce, and a rise of towns, all of which have been argued to increase the amount of household-bound activity for women. So what this translates to is that bride price is more likely to happen in a society where women contribute some form of income to the household, meaning that they're out there working on the fields and they're contributing to, the growth of the crops or raising the livestock. A bride price is necessary because you're essentially taking a productive member away from her family and they're losing out. So you got to pay them a compensation and you're gaining because she's going to be doing work in your household. And as technology for agriculture developed and it became more of man's work, especially when you're pushing a heavy plow and it takes a lot more strength in order to do. This changed because men's economic output was now greater than that of women, and it led to women doing other types of work like household stuff, because the production coming from plow agriculture is much greater than if you're using light tools. So the increased production that you're getting from agriculture then leads to other things. Now there's a surplus. It's leading to trade, and it's leading to urbanization and the creation of urban style living in cities. So we're seeing a huge change in how the economy works. The other side of this, as the economy changes and men start to become stratified, some guys make more money, some guys make less money, but overall they're making more money than the women. You start to see dowry come into play, because now their economic output is higher, the woman's is less, and you start to see their families offering a dowry amount in order to get the woman married to a, quote unquote, higher status guy. Consider first a primitive tribal society with homogeneous men and homogeneous women, but where women have economic value of their own via their input into agriculture production, and hence receive a bride price in equilibrium. Suppose that new wage earning opportunities open up for men while drawing women into the home. Women remain a homogeneous group with less economic value, while men become a heterogeneous group differentiated by their wage earning capabilities. As a result, brides compete amongst themselves for the more desirable grooms. Brides with wealthier fathers outbid poorer ones in the marriage market and award dowries to the grooms with the higher earning power. Thus, dowry payments emerge due to quality differentiation amongst grooms as found in socially stratified societies, and are consistent with a development process where women do not directly reap the benefits of modernization and men are the primary recipients of the new economic opportunities. So, if you ever looked at red pill stuff, you're going to kind of recognize some stuff in that paragraph. And it's essentially the concept of hypergamy, right? They're trying to get their daughters married to someone either within their class or higher up. And the compensation for the hypergamous action is a dowry amount paid to the higher status males in order to convince them and make it worth it to marry a daughter. The other part of that is looking at the economic output of both the men and the women. As the women become housewives, and that's what they're relegated to do because economic opportunities only exist for the men, it becomes this thing where one housewife's value is kind of worth the same value as another housewife's in terms of actual labor output. So their incomes are relatively homogenous in the sense of the value they're producing is homogenous. Let's say if everything else stays the same, the age of the woman and the beauty of the woman and all these kinds of things. But looking over at the other side, some men are making an average income, some are making a higher income, some are making less income. And there's what's called heterogeneity in the income pool there. So what you see is a change of the marriage transaction being paid towards the man's side in order to pair up the woman with a higher earner ideally. And then that marriage transaction amount is going to become lower and lower and lower as you go down the hierarchy. The next explanation for what's more likely to happen when it comes to a bride price instead of a dowry is the type of marriage. So there's long-term monogamous marriages, and that's what we're used to here in the West, right? I mean, what they encourage here, the culture is to get married to one person, and then you're out of the marriage market, and then ideally you don't get divorced. And that's how a lot of people talk about marriage today. Ideally, they want to be married to their partner for life and not get divorced. Hasn't been working out lately, but that is the model we're trying to live by. The other side of that is a polygynous marriage. So if you have a man that can marry more than one woman, typically you're going to find a culture that practices bride price because there's more competition amongst the males for the ladies. The use of bride price has tended to correlate with polygyny. Men have more than one wife, and also with the possibility of divorce. In contrast, monogamy is the norm and divorce is rare in dowry-paying societies. For example, bride price is near universal in sub-Saharan Africa, where more than 95% of societies are traditionally polygynous. Polygyny was also permitted in ancient Israel, Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, classical China, and Islamic countries, all of which commonly had the burden of marriage payments falling to the groom's side. So that illustrates it right there. And it shows kind of how the economics of that work. And what's interesting is polygyny used to be allowed in ancient Israel, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. But as it changed into a more urbanized society where their agriculture developed and they started living in cities, that moved more towards monogamy. And then it also changed more towards a dowry paying society away from a bride price paying society. If we bring it back to 2024, typically when we discuss marriage, out here, it's about getting married for life. At least that's how it's presented. And people don't really want to get divorced. So that would fall more in line with a dowry paying society. And that is what we saw going through most of Europe. And that lasted for a long time. There's a helpful chart in here we can look at that shows us what the typical dowry payment is. So this goes chronologically. And if you look at the top, you see Athens at 6th century BC. There's the birthplace of democracy right there. So cradle of Western civilization. A typical dowry payment paid to the man was 10% of the bride's father's wealth. That's a pretty hefty sum of money. I mean, if you're a young guy getting married. Going down to Mediterranean Jews, 969 to 1250, you get about 150 through 1500 dinars. So that's a little bit of a range, but you can see right here in this column to the right, 800 dinars could maintain a family for 30 years. Wow. Could you imagine getting married as a guy and you get 30 years of income just right off rip? Then going down, we're going into urban Tuscany, Florence, where you see 1,430 florins, which is about 3 times the average fiscal wealth per household. So that's what like normal is for most of European Western history. And we kind of live with this mythology now that men are just supposed to be ready to be married, in your mid-20s or something. And you need to already have everything lined up to buy a house, to pay all these bills. And the woman comes with nothing, right? That's the mythology that we're told. But the reality is that most of Western civilization practice this dowry amount where there is some payment made towards the guy. And typically the expectation is that the guy has some kind of income potential. Not that you're necessarily rich, but maybe you come from a wealthy family, or it looks like, you're going to have a good career ahead of you. As already emphasized, dowry-paying societies are stratified, monogamous, and endogamous. Men and women of equal status marry. In traditional societies, where men have economic value but women do not, dowry as a bequest is consistent with this marriage pattern. Wealthier parents tend to give higher dowries, which in turn render their daughters more attractive to grooms. Grooms who have higher incomes are in turn more attractive to brides. As a result, grooms with high incomes match with the daughters from families where the optimal size of bequest is large, implying positive assortative matching in the marriage market. So what that tells me is that if you're going to be the breadwinner for the family, you can demand some kind of wealth transfer at the time of marriage. And it sounds crazy, but I think we live in a society now where you see different kinds of people trying to do different kinds of marriage that are a mix between traditional and some parts of progressive, and they're anywhere on the spectrum. And given our marriage laws the way they are now with no-fault divorce, sometimes people start as traditional and then suddenly they want to be progressive midway through. That is the Coach Greg Adams bait and switch, or praying mantis as he likes to describe. But what does this look like today? So let's try to apply some of this to 2024. Let's say you're a guy and you got like a decent paying job. All right, you're an engineer, you got your master's degree, you're like 26 now, things are going well, you make over $100,000 a year. And, you meet a woman and everything's cool, but she wants to be a traditional stay-at-home wife. And you're the man and you're supposed to protect and provide, and she's going to be a nurturer and, do whatever, the housework and do the laundry and the dishes and all that stuff. Okay. Nowadays, the expectation is, well, you just get married and do that. And that is the hope that the woman wants you to do. But given the marriage laws and how easily a divorce can get broken and how easily your life can get ruined, I think men should demand a kind of insurance. And it's like, okay, if she doesn't want to work, and if her family wants that life for her, instead of sending her to college, maybe negotiate that with the husband and say, listen, you're a fine young man, and we like that you got a great career ahead of you, and we want you to be a good man for our daughter. I am going to give you this wealth to get your household started, to have this going on, with my daughter, ideally, and I know it's going to be a good marriage. Or let's say she works and you both work. So you guys make around the same amount of money. Well, then why would anybody pay the other side anything? If anything, she's been working, you've been working, you guys can split the bills on the house, the down payment and everything, and just equally contribute to the pot. No payment necessary because there's no difference in economic output between the two parties. The other example of that is if, let's say, a woman's 27 and suddenly she changes her mind and says, I want to be a stay-at-home mom. But, she's been dating and doing all this stuff out there. She's gone to college. She has a career. I would still ask that woman, like, okay, I'll consider marriage, but like, what are you bringing financially? Because you've been doing something from 18 to 27. And if it has anything to do with the career, have you saved any of that money? Why would you expect me to pay 100% of that? You should at least bring something, and then you can buy your way into being a stay-at-home wife. It shouldn't just come for free. And men have just been giving it away for free for so long, and now men are starting to wake up and understand that they've been getting shortchanged in this entire scenario. And that's why things like the soft guy era are so hilarious to me, because I think they have a kernel of truth in them. The men, especially if you're a high status man, and you see that all the time, especially with some of the divorces we cover on this channel, is that a high status guy will marry, a woman of pretty normal income or no income, and then she ends up getting divorced. It's not lifelong monogamy because the laws are what they are, and he gets screwed over. But it's like, if you're that guy and you're, a star and you're making good money and you got good income potential going forward, you should not be afraid to demand something from the other side. And if she has nothing, she's a bum. And if her family has nothing to give her, her entire family is comprised of bums. And it's an interesting thing to me because we can see how families used to work. You know what I mean? There was part of a family wealth that was saved. When the marriage occurred, you had this sort of built-in system of wealth transfer from generation to generation. Looking at our paper again, Botticini and Xiao also assume that dowry payments represent an intergenerational transfer from parents and ask why daughters receive their inheritance in the form of a dowry at the time of marriage, while sons receive theirs as a bequest. They posit that parents transfer dowries to daughters and bequests to sons to solve a free riding problem that occurs in patrilocal societies. In these societies, daughters join the husband's household and married sons remain with their parents. If married daughters share in the parents' bequests, sons will not get the full benefits of their efforts to extend the family wealth, and as a result will supply too little effort. To mitigate this problem, altruistic parents give bequests to sons and dowries to daughters. This theory is consistent with societies where daughters who received dowries were excluded from future bequests, as they explained was the case in ancient Greece and Israel, 13th century Byzantine law, and some parts of medieval Western Europe. So that's another significant thing, because the other aspect that kind of hovers around these marriage transactions is the question of inheritance. And typically with dowries, what you would see is that represented the woman's inheritance from her family wealth that she's coming from. It's a pretty big burden on the family to get their daughters married, because at the time of her marriage, they need to have some amount of money to give her to go into the new household in the form of the dowry. The son doesn't get his inheritance until after the family, until after the parents pass, and then he typically gets the land to keep it in, as far as the patrilineal pass down of landed property goes. So she would get wealth as far as like gold and movable products goes. He gets the immovable stuff like the land. But nowadays, I don't know if that's really a question for most parents. I think most parents kind of let their kids sort of just, hey, you're out of the house at 18 and try to figure out getting married on your own. Our money's for our retirement. Maybe you'll get some when we pass away. And they're not really thinking in terms of let's save money for our children's marriage in order to help kick off their household, as is our duty as parents. And I think the reason that happened is because, we experienced an economic boom after World War II, and we had this kind of boomer generation where you could leave the house at 18 and find a normal job right out of high school and make good money that can sustain a house and a whole family and all that kind of stuff. But it's not like that anymore. And in fact, it's more like how it was before all that kind of stuff. You know, it's hard now. It's not easy to just go out there and get a house and pay for a family, especially on one income as a guy. So now I think parents need to be thinking about that, especially if you're going to have kids. Think about, okay, I should be working hard to be saving for their marriages going forward. If you're a guy and you don't want your daughter, you know, out here tearing up these streets, and you want to have some kind of influence over her, obviously you can't force her to do anything against her will. But what you can do is learn how to negotiate. You can say, hey, listen, you know, you're 18, 19 now. If you want to go to college, that's fine. You know, maybe I'll help pay for your tuition, whatever. Or you can say, I have $200,000 set aside, and we can put that towards your marriage if you would like, if you don't want to be a career woman and you want to find some eligible suitor, maybe we can get a proposal put together and try to offer that. You know, is that going to be something popular? Do most people want to do that? I don't know. It does sound a little old world, but you got to remember, we live in a time where chivalry is dead. And some might say feminism killed it.
Why do people believe that chivalry is dead and feminism killed it?
It did. It absolutely 100% did. Women push for too much of equality. I want a man's man. I want him to treat me like a man. I want equal opinions, but at the same time, I definitely want a man that can protect, hold doors open, do things for me. I want to be feminine. I don't want to be like a man. Some women do, and that's okay. Not my thing, but I do think feminism kind of ruined it for us.
Do women want to be independent while also being provided for? And if so, who's more delusional in their wants?
Actually, yeah, that's probably pretty true. I'm going to be honest with that one. We're probably more delusional. We want equality, we want this, but we want a man to take care of us too. So, yeah, women are definitely, that's our problem.
And that kind of brings us to, why did the dowry go away in the first place? Marriage payments have tended to decline and eventually to disappear. The reasons why have not been well understood, though anthropologists have offered some conjectures. Lambiri Dimaki marks the advent of industrialization as the turning point in the history of dowry in Europe. Goody similarly points to industrialization in Europe as the cause of disappearance in marriage payments by the 19th century. According to him, the process of decline in marriage payments began with the urban classes, later followed by the rural. So that's one explanation. Another one is, according to Botticini and Xiao, dowry payments disappear when the development process leads male children to become less likely to work and live with their parents. This change corresponds to the development and diversification of the labor market. Moreover, as the return to investing in human capital increases, the use of requests to align work incentives becomes less important. In Anderson, I attribute the decline and disappearance of dowry to the breakdown in inherited status and endogamous matching. This outcome would follow with a modernization process that transforms a hierarchical society based on inherited status into a more individualistic one based on achievement. Once the preservation of inherited status through marriage ceases to be important, endogamy, an essential constituent of stratified social order, is no longer necessary. Another aspect that I think is important that's mentioned is, in theory, dowry as a pre-mortem inheritance is set up to protect property given to women. However, this institution seems to often transform into one in which these property rights are given to men. Early feminists in Europe attacked the dowry system precisely because they objected to the fact that husbands ended up controlling the funds. So, you know, the feminists kind of get into it and they don't like the dowry system. They want to work and all that stuff. I would say going even before that, you had the rise of chivalry. And that kind of created the pedestalization of women. And at the same time, they're experiencing a rapid industrialization in Europe. So both of these changes to the culture are occurring at the same time, and it just leads to something completely different. I mean, romance is here now, and the men are trying to prove themselves to the women more, and I think that's one factor for why it changed, but also because people couldn't afford it. We go through Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the way families and status works starts to change, and it seems like they can't pin it down to one exact thing, but they know it has to do with industrialization. And I think just here living in the US, it seems like something that's so far away from us because, well, both men and women can work. We're not really traditional, even though there are people out there who claim to be traditional, but to me, that's more just this 1950s fantasy of what a traditional family is supposed to look like. That's like nothing to do with how traditional families actually worked. As feminism started to gain hold and society started to change, eventually you do see actual laws put out there that outlaw dowry. So you can't really formally do it in a lot of places. In certain places in the world, old habits die hard and they still do it, like in India, where they have a case-based system. And a lot of times dowry is associated with that, which is kind of different from how we live, where we see everyone as equal. And what you see is even there, dowry is technically prohibited and outlawed, but I think a lot of families, they still kind of practice it anyway because that's just part of their culture and how it still works over there. I think in today's society, what we see a lot of is a lot of people that are in and out of the marriage market, or the dating market, you can say. And if you're this like high status guy, which is a small percentage of people, they can leverage that to kind of date many women, but they don't really want to be locked down with one. So if they're not locked down with one way to get them to kind of play ball in that way would be to offer a high status male a kind of dowry, to say, okay, you are now committed to this one woman and you're taking that deal. On the other side, if you have people that are kind of lower on the financial ladder and both the man and the woman work, then really expecting the guy to be the total provider, it doesn't make sense, because you're both working, you both have a similar economic output, and if no wealth transfer is coming from the prior generation, it's a bit unreasonable to expect to be able to get a house right off the bat and have all these kinds of things. So if you want people marrying young and you want the birth rate to increase, so, you know, young people are having kids earlier and then ideally having more kids since they're taking advantage of their most fertile years, the only way to encourage that is you need the older generations investing their wealth into the younger generation's marriages, which is what we saw in a dowry society. So that's something for us to think about. The other sort of conversation I think that people probably think of is, where does love fit into all of this? Love and romance and finding your soulmate and all these kinds of things. I think we have to face the unfortunate reality that love kind of takes a back seat now, especially when it comes to marriage and these kinds of things. You know, chivalry is gone. That sort of romantic knight getting on one knee and slaying dragons because he loves, you know, milady, is not exactly here anymore. And, you know, we can say that's for different reasons. I think a lot of people would probably blame feminism for that, as women have decided to take on a different role and step out of a traditional role. So love really isn't the determining factor as far as a marriage goes. And there are a lot of people who get married with the real politique strategy. And a lot of women will do this. They'll look for a high income earning guy to lock down. And we've seen stories and stories and stories of guys getting screwed over after that. And the way I look at it is, if you're a guy and you make a lot of money and you're just going to marry someone who brings no economic value to you, you're getting shortchanged in that marriage deal. So we got to get back to understanding how to negotiate between families, or just between you and her, into what the household is going to look like. I mean, I think that's a conversation that should be had amongst couples. I mean, she's pressuring you to marriage. You might want to say, okay, so, you know, what does that look like to you? Where do you want to live? How many kids do you want? And she's like, oh, I want a 3-bedroom house and 2 kids. You can say, well, typical house around here is going to be $550,000. I mean, then that doesn't even figure in the amount of interest you're going to pay, and probably paying over because people are bidding on it. 2 kids, a kid typically, you know, that's going to be like another $200,000 over the life of taking care of that kid. So 2 of those, I mean, you're looking at almost $1 million investment. Like, what are you bringing to the table? You're age 27. You went to school. You got student loan debt. You've saved no money. Marriage just isn't for you. It's just not for you. What have you done with all these years? Now, if she's young and she's got some, you know, wealth behind her, her parents are decent people, they might say, you know, we love our daughter and we want what's best for her. We want her to be a stay-at-home mom. Here's going to be our investment into your 2's lives. We're going to help you with the down payment on the house. We're going to help you with that. And then that will help to facilitate a marriage at a younger age. It takes a lot of the burden off of the man, which we know from looking at the history here was not always the case. Young men were able to get married younger because they were receiving a dowry payment. At least most of them in Western society were, unless you're going to go the polygynous route and marry multiple wives. Then a bride price makes sense. I can see that. But that's not what we're doing over here. Or are we polygamous now? Another thing that, I hear a lot of, especially from the tradcon side, is that, if you just rely on like your faith or your religious beliefs, that's enough to figure out the marriage, even if you're making a ton of money and she's not bringing anything to the marriage. But I think that's ridiculous, because historically, a lot of these religious societies have relied on something like a marriage transaction or a dowry. And it's like, just at a basic level, there's two aspects almost to like the human experience. There's the material body, and then there's like the spiritual soul. You know what I mean? And the material body has its needs. It needs sustenance. It needs all these very real material goods, housing, in order to keep it going. And you need that. The wife needs that. The kids needs that. So before the marriage, there is a material negotiation when it comes to a dowry or bride price or whatever it is. And once that's figured out, then you go down to your religious institution, wherever you want to go, and you get that spiritually sealed to figure out, the soul part of this equation. So one of the big mistakes tradcons do now is that they don't look at the material stuff at all, other than the man needs to do everything, because that's all they're trained to say. And they're just like, just rely on the covenant marriage, the covenant marriage, the covenant marriage. But that's not good enough. We're missing an entire half of what marriage used to be. Anyways, I hope you guys learned a little bit from this. Again, if you want to check out the paper, it's called The Economics of Dowry and Bride Price. There's a lot of literature on this, and it's been pretty fascinating to read. It's been kind of eye-opening for me, because I for one, am kind of sick of hearing people's interpretations of what traditionalism looked like. But then when you really dig into what traditionalism looks like, you're like, wait a minute, we don't do any of this stuff today. And people will just kind of look at this as if it's old and primitive, but we're trying to cosplay traditionalism. We're trying to sit here and be like, well, we're going to get married because we're traditional. But then when you look at how society actually survived practicing these traditional, things, they had all these other sort of things surrounding marriage that helped to facilitate marriage, none of which we're practicing today. So it's like, there are pieces to this. There are marriage transactions. There's the inheritance and the transfer of wealth when the parents pass or when the daughter gets married. There's marriage laws that make sense. There's a community involvement. And all of these things work together as integral parts of a successful marriage and successful community. Nowadays, we're just kind of flying in the fog, trying to, just make something happen as we go, and we're not even thinking about any of this stuff. And now most people can't even afford to get married or buy a house for that matter. So anyways, let me know what you think. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. This was a tough video for me because there was a lot of information to share, and I really wish I could have shared more of it. I just know it would make the video probably really long. So there might be more to come on this subject, but I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. And I do hope that the soft guys realize they're getting shortchanged and start demanding some kind of economic input from the woman's side. See you next time.